Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at A Nightmare on Elm Street, an action platforming title developed by Rare and published by LJN for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1990. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into A Nightmare on Elm Street, I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about why I chose A Nightmare on Elm Street for today's episode. And the fact is, the reason is that it is almost Halloween. And I've looked back, I've looked at our podcast episodes, and we've talked about some spookier kinds of games before. We talked about Phantasmagoria. We talked about Harvester. We have had some spooky games on the podcast. But for whatever reason, I've never planned well enough to actually have a spooky game or a couple of spooky games actually coincide with Halloween. And to be honest with you, I didn't plan this right either for this one. I did not have originally the intention to cover A Nightmare on Elm Street for today's episode. I had a completely different game picked out that was not spooky at all. But then I started thinking to myself, wait a second. It is almost Halloween, and wouldn't it make sense to look at a couple of spooky games around Halloween? So that is exactly what we're going to do. Today's episode is going to be focused on A Nightmare on Elm Street, which from a movie perspective is probably one of the most well-known horror movies of all time, or at a minimum, one of the most well-known horror movie franchises of all time, because there's been around 57 of those. And then our next episode, we are going to be looking at another spookier kind of game, that being Uninvited for the NES. So both The Nightmare on Elm Street and Uninvited we're going to look at, and for both of those, we're going to look at the NES incarnations of those particular games. So hopefully adding in a little bit of spookiness to the Halloween season will be a good thing. We're going to try it, at least. And even though I didn't plan it, what the heck, every now and then we have to pivot. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So going back to A Nightmare on Elm Street, which is the focus of today's episode, beyond just wanting to pick something that was related to a spookier kind of movie that's been released in the past, I have a couple of other personal perspectives to share around why I chose this specific game. First of all, I need to mention that when I was a kid, I loved A Nightmare on Elm Street, both the movie series as well as the game, but specifically, I owned the original A Nightmare on Elm Street on the NES, and I would play that thing for hours. I remember thinking how cool it was. So this was released in 1990, so at that point I was around 9 years old, and I remember staying up late into the night playing A Nightmare on Elm Street, never really getting all that far. At the time, I used to think it was a pretty challenging game, but I remember playing all night. I'm talking till like 12, 1, 2 a.m. in the morning as a 9-year-old playing this game, being totally enraptured by the action on the screen and how scary it was. that at any point after I fell asleep, I might be attacked by Freddy Krueger, the movie and the game's main antagonist. I remember being really scared when I was younger and thinking, oh no, I don't want to fight Freddy. Freddy's going to destroy me. And I just have such fond memories of playing that game. Now, the thing is that back then, I never did beat the game. And like I mentioned, I never really got all that far until I plugged the game into my Game Genie. The Game Genie, for anybody who may not be aware, was an add-on device that you could put into your console. You could attach a game to the Game Genie, and then there were a number of different codes you could put in for different games that would effectively give you any degree of power-ups. You could get invincibility, you can get infinite lives, you could get infinite ammo, depending on the game, obviously, because different games were designed differently. But the Game Genie basically was a cheat code. It was your way to cheat your way to victory, and I am not proud to admit it, but when I was younger, the Game Genie was my friend, and I would use it anytime I faced a game that was overly challenging. I'd think to myself, well, hey, let me grab the Game Genie. I'm going to put the game in the Game Genie, going to look up if there's a code there, because the Game Genie actually came with a book full of codes that you could put in for different games. So I put the Game Genie in my console, I put Nightmare on Elm Street into the Game Genie, and I put in the codes for infinite lives, and I might have used invincibility as well. I'm not entirely sure, but I remember getting it all set up, and then I played through the game, and at that point, Freddy was no longer a challenge. He wasn't a scary figure. He was just another enemy because I couldn't take any damage. So I had a great time playing the game. And I always remember really enjoying the game, whether I was playing it with the Game Genie or I was playing it just the standard way you play it without any sort of cheats or assistance at all. I always remember enjoying A Nightmare on Elm Street. Like I said, it was pretty hard without the Game Genie, but it was fun. And because I was a big fan of horror movies and I enjoyed A Nightmare on Elm Street from a film perspective, it really ticked all the boxes for me. And it was one of my go-to games whenever I wanted to be a little bit spooked and play something that had some degree of tie into that movie series. A Nightmare on Elm Street was what I was going to go for. Now, in later years, I would go back and I'd start looking at different games from my youth. As you all know, the reason for this podcast in the first place was primarily to explore my own personally fueled nostalgia around different games that I might have played. And of course, we've expanded beyond that now to include games that I may not have played, but am trying to play because I have personal blind spots in my own gaming history. But A Nightmare on Elm Street is one of those areas I did not have a blind spot. I've played that game before, and as I started looking at the game later on, once I was an adult, I realized that the reviews were not entirely kind for the game. As a matter of fact, there were several reviews that were pretty unkind, to put it mildly. And because A Nightmare on Elm Street was a licensed title, it kind of got lumped in with that whole licensed title equals lower quality kind of perspective that pervades most licensed titles in the video game industry. I was curious though, is it really a situation where Nightmare on Elm Street, the game, was just a cash grab, that it didn't have any redeeming qualities? I remember playing this game. I remember having fun with it. Yet modern reviews in particular, the contemporary reviews that came out when the game was originally released, not all of them were terribly unkind. They kind of looked at it as a mediocre experience. But retrospective analysis, especially on the internet where various personalities want to create videos or podcasts or reviews that are going to effectively try to really amp up the perspective as far as, oh my God, this is a licensed game, it has to be horrible, and here's why. That kind of thing, that's pretty prevalent. And there's not a ton of people today that look at A Nightmare on Elm Street, the game for the NES, and say, hey, that was actually a quality experience. As always, I am not going to base my own opinion on what other people say. I'm going to base my own opinion on actually playing the game myself. So that is exactly what I decided to do. And my question, as I sat down to play the game for this episode, was, is A Nightmare on Elm Street really just an LJN licensed title cash grab, despite the fact that it was created by a game development studio, Rare, that would eventually be recognized as one of the most talented studios in the entire world? Or has A Nightmare on Elm Street been unfairly criticized as licensed shovelware? That's the question we're going to answer as we dive deep into A Nightmare on Elm Street. A Nightmare on Elm Street is an action platforming title developed by Rare and published by LJN for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1990. Before we can talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street, the game, we need to talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street, the movie, which was released back in 1984 and very quickly became one of the most popular horror movies, and by extension, horror movie franchises, pretty much in history. I mean, I don't know if there is anybody that has watched a horror movie or been interested in horror movies who doesn't know who Freddy Krueger is, Freddy being the main antagonist from the film. So let's talk a little bit about A Nightmare on Elm Street. For anyone who may not be aware, A Nightmare on Elm Street centers on a group of teenagers who, every time they go to sleep at night, are being tormented by this evil spirit, demonic entity kind of thing named Freddy Krueger, a horribly burned and disfigured man who has fashioned himself a glove made out of knives. And effectively what he does is every time that these teenagers dream, he infests their dreams and attempts to scare and ultimately kill them. The question is, why the heck would Freddy Krueger start doing that to these groups of seemingly unrelated teenagers? And the fact is, there is actually a plot behind that. The situation is that Freddy Krueger back years ago had been somebody who was effectively a child murderer. He would attract children to his lair and would ultimately kill them. And as you might expect, the populace in the general area, they knew what Freddy was doing, and they wanted him placed behind bars and punished for all of his crimes. Unfortunately, Freddy was able to get off of whatever the charges were through a mere technicality. There was some sort of technicality around how he was arrested or the evidence that was gathered, and Freddy effectively went back to his job. He was a janitor at Elm Street High School. So he was actually working in a situation where he was around kids all the time. He was a murderer, and he was unfortunately let off. So what ended up happening was a group of individuals decided to take justice into their own hands. They captured Freddy, they tortured him, they burnt him to death. And then they figured that they had made the world a better and safer place. Unfortunately, despite not existing in the physical world anymore, Freddy now belongs to the dream world, and he has held a grudge for many, many years. So, as the teenage children of the individuals that had once hunted down and killed Freddy, he is now infesting their dreams and attempting to exact revenge on those children, basically saying, okay, I am going to take your children from you because you, who are now parents, you took my life. And that's effectively the setup for the movie. And there's a little bit, and I apologize if anybody has not seen that film. I should have mentioned that there's going to be a little bit of spoilers there. But I mean, it's a horror movie. It's Freddy Krueger. Hopefully everybody knows at least who that is and what the general concept is. So in the very first A Nightmare on Elm Street film, Freddy does in fact go after several of these teenagers. He does, of course, kill several of them, but is ultimately thwarted by a single teenager named Nancy. Nancy is able to survive through I guess the best way to put it is she effectively figures out a way to pull Freddy out of the dream world. And before she does that, she sets up her own house with a bunch of traps that are very reminiscent to what we would later see in Home Alone with Kevin McAllister and Macaulay Culkin, the actor, going around and setting up all these traps for the wet bandits to fall into. Nancy basically did the same thing for Freddy, albeit that predates the release of Home Alone by at least 6-ish years. So Nancy thought of it first, and that was originally part of A Nightmare on Elm Street. She basically set up a house full of traps, eventually captured Freddy, and did emerge victorious, though at the end of that movie, you will realize that Freddy is not actually defeated, which of course sets up the next entire set of movies. And A Nightmare on Elm Street, from a film franchise perspective, has so many movies that I have legitimately lost count. It even had a reboot several years ago that recast Robert Englund's role, which was Freddy Krueger, with another actor. That one didn't really go all that great. But regardless, A Nightmare on Elm Street, from a film perspective, is one of those movies and franchises that almost everyone at least knows about. You may not have seen the film, but I can almost guarantee you've probably heard of it, and you've probably heard of Freddy Krueger. Now, when Freddy Krueger and when A Nightmare on Elm Street was being conceptualized, it was really thought about and created by a man named Wes Craven, who was a filmmaker. And he wanted to create a film that was going to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who would watch it. And to do that, he would take some inspiration from various real-life events that he himself had either experienced or witnessed. As Craven was conceptualizing how to make this film, he knew that he didn't want to do something entirely derivative. At this point in history, in film history, Halloween with Michael Myers, Friday the 13th with Jason Voorhees, or more accurately, Jason's mother, at least in the first film, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and other slasher films had already come out, and it was becoming a very popular genre of horror film. The thing with most of those movies, though, is that the majority of the antagonists in those films were silent. They didn't have much of a personality other than kill and destroy. And Craven didn't want to just copy that archetype for use in his new film. He did take inspiration from certain real-world events that he had either witnessed or experienced. And in particular, the concept of nightmares actually being able to kill people came about because there were a series of newspaper articles in the Los Angeles Times in the 1970s that actually described various Asian refugees who were living in LA at the time who had died in their sleep, presumably unexpectedly. They didn't really know what was happening there. Craven recalled those news articles and thought, well, hey, I wonder if I could create a film where nightmares can actually lead to death in the real world. And then the whole concept of Freddy Krueger, the character, the main antagonist of the film, was based on a couple of different people that Craven had actually encountered in real life. One was simply an old man that was walking down the street who, when Craven was a child, turned towards him and apparently startled him. So Craven thought, oh my God, that was scary. And I guess it must have stuck with him because that whole concept, that old guy, stuck with Craven and became kind of the framework for Freddy Krueger as a character, which that sounds kind of weird, to be honest with you. And then secondly, perhaps a little bit less weird, is when Craven was a child, he would be bullied in school by a boy named Fred Krueger. So those two inspirations would eventually form the foundation of Freddy Krueger, the character. But beyond those inspirations, Craven knew that he wanted Freddy Krueger to have a personality. So rather than be a silent killer who stalked teenagers in the night, Freddy would instead actually have quite a few lines of dialogue. He would be very vocal throughout the entire film. And as the film series progressed, he would actually become more and more vocal, eventually turning into a one-line spouting demon of hate who would basically kill anybody in his path, but not before spouting off a one-liner like a deranged, deformed Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's effectively what Freddy Krueger would become. But the very first A Nightmare on Elm Street film was not played for laughs. It was played for dread. That's exactly what Wes Craven wanted to elicit from anybody who watched the film. Now, A Nightmare on Elm Street was originally filmed on a budget of $1.1 million, which even back in the early 80s was not that sizable of an amount of money. But it would become insanely popular. It would eventually gross $57.1 million, over 50 times its original budget it would make back. That, my friends, is a tidy profit. And in the process, it would be declared by many to be one of the best horror movies of all time, and certainly gained a degree of respect for both the film as well as its creator, Wes Craven. As you might expect, when a popular movie comes out and makes a ton of money, there are a bunch of companies that want to attempt to profit from that success. And given the proliferation of video games as the 1980s progressed, one of the best ways for companies to make some money off of other people's work was to license those popular properties and create derivative works off of them. Which, incidentally, was game publisher LJN's major claim to fame. So let's talk a little bit about LJN. LJN, from its very earliest days, was no stranger to licensing properties for their own products. And in fact, it was founded in 1967 by Jack Friedman as LJN Toys. So LJN's original focus was as a toy manufacturer, and its goal was very clear from the beginning. Simply put, LJN wanted to make as much money as possible. And Jack Friedman had seen just how popular other toy companies like Mattel were. They made a ton of money. Mattel in particular was basically rolling in the dough. And Friedman considered maybe he could make some money making toys himself. Though Friedman was not a creative person. I don't want to say that. He wasn't the creative type. He wasn't the kind of person that was going to create brand new intellectual property to make money. He was a businessman, and he considered, rather than make a bunch of standalone new toys based on intellectual property that didn't even exist, Friedman would decide to instead begin creating various licensing agreements with television production studios, where his company, would release toys to the masses based on popular television series that millions of people would watch each and every week. Despite the fact that LJN wouldn't really release many original toys, the company would be incredibly successful in their licensing pursuits. So just listen to a few of these examples of how LJN made a ton of money through licensed properties. The first, and perhaps the most, I would say, surprising on the list, is E.T. Retrospectively, if I told you, hey, you could license E.T. for around $25,000 before the film came out, knowing today that E.T. would become the highest grossing film of all time at its release. So certainly not today, but at the point of its release, E.T. was and would become the highest grossing film of all time. If I told you that it would only cost $25,000 to license E.T. for toys, I think most people, assuming you had the money, would do that. The thing is, though, back when E.T. was originally coming out, all toy companies, they passed on it. They didn't want to license E.T. They didn't think that E.T. was going to be a big seller. So LJN, when they looked at it, they said, oh, you only need $25,000 for that license? What the heck? We'll roll the dice. Well, E.T., like I just mentioned, would become a big deal. It would become the highest grossing film of all time when it released. And LJN, for just $25,000, would earn the rights to build and make toys based on E.T., which would make them over $20 million just on those E.T. toys alone. They didn't even have to sponsor or pay for an advertising campaign. E.T. the movie sold the toys. And is another reason why, when we talked about E.T. for the Atari 2600, why Atari was willing to spend millions of dollars to secure that license. E.T. was a big deal. LJN, before E.T. was released, managed to scoop up the toy license for E.T. for just $25,000, and in the process would dramatically multiply that investment into actual profit. They would also license additional properties. One was another big deal, which was a doll based on Brooke Shields. Brooke Shields was a teenage actress whose popularity at the time was based on 1980's highly questionable, given her age of only being 14 at the time, the film Blue Lagoon. She was in that film and she became incredibly popular. LJN was able to create a doll based on Brooke Shields, and that singular doll would gross $12 million in sales. That one did, in fact, have an advertising campaign behind it, which I believe was around $2 million. So even with that, LJN would make around $10 million just by creating a doll of Brooke Shields. They would also strike deals with the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, to create wrestling figures that people, countless kids, myself included, would purchase and play with, as well as Thundercats action figures. Thundercats being a very popular cartoon from the 80s, which, once again, I owned a bunch of the Thundercats figures. So I gave LJN a fair amount of my money, or more accurately, my parents' money, back when I was a kid. LJN knew how to license properties, and they knew how to garner attention amongst their demographic, which was, of course, kids. So they were making a ton of money based on these toys. And the simple fact is that LJN would dramatically grow in size over just a 10-year period. In 1971, LJN was making around $5 million a year. By 1982, those sales figures had increased to $70 million, and it would grow even further in later years. Like we've been talking about, LJN's original focus was on toys, but as the new digital era of video games proliferated across the industry, LJN would see the writing on the wall, and they would also pivot, and would end up becoming one of the most prolific publishing studios for licensed titles in the world, working closely with talented development studios to create games based on film and television properties. LJN's goal remained the same. They wanted to make as much money as possible, and they would stop at nothing to acquire licenses to all sorts of properties. Which is why, when revolutionary horror film A Nightmare on Elm Street continued to earn itself fans, both with its original release as well as a variety of sequels released over the years, it wasn't much of a surprise that LJN would want to create a game based on that film series. And because LJN didn't have a development team on staff, that meant that they would have to work with an external development studio to create their own new Nightmare on Elm Street game. And here, they would end up working with a company that they had some experience with, the UK development studio, Rare. We have talked a lot about Rare before. We're going to talk about Rare again in the future. The simple fact is, Rare as a studio was one of the most well-respected and talented teams in all of gaming. Originally founded as Ultimate Play the Game, Rare would evolve over the years to become a studio almost without equal. They would always push technology in their games. We saw that very clearly in the 90s as they pioneered unique graphics tricks for the Donkey Kong Country series. We would see how they would pivot to support the Nintendo 64 in later years with releases like Killer Instinct, Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, and countless other titles. They would even push the envelope of good taste when they released Conker's Bad Fur Day around the year 2000. Rare was firing on all cylinders. They continued to release hit after hit from the late 80s through the 90s and into the early 2000s. The thing is, around the time when LJN was working with Rare, that was before Rare became a development studio almost without equal. Rare was still trying to find its footing. Sure, it had impressed Nintendo by being able to reverse engineer the copy protection scheme on the Nintendo Entertainment System, or Famicom, at the time, to be able to create cartridges even without the keys to the virtual kingdom that Nintendo thought would prevent unauthorized carts from being produced. So Rare was already in Nintendo's good graces and was a partner of Nintendo for working on a bunch of different titles. But Rare was not an exclusive partner. They had to make sure that anything they worked on would release on Nintendo's console ecosystem. So they had to work on games that would release on the Famicom or the NES. But that didn't mean that they couldn't strike out publishing or get publishing deals with other companies. And LJN, for its part, did work with Rare back in 1989 on the NES title Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which of course was another film licensed property that we actually have a whole episode focused on. So if you really want to learn about Who Framed Roger Rabbit, we have an episode that covers that. But beyond Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which, by the way, from my perspective, was actually way better than most people give it credit. But beyond that, LJN recognized that Rare was a talented company, and they knew that they wanted to keep making money. So when LJN acquired the license to A Nightmare on Elm Street, they knew that they could work with Rare to hopefully deliver an experience that people would enjoy playing, which is why Rare would eventually begin development on the NES version of the horror platforming title A Nightmare on Elm Street. Despite the talent of Rare's team, when they sat down to begin creating A Nightmare on Elm Street for the NES, they didn't exactly know what they wanted the game to be. And the earliest concepts for the game, which actually did make it to the point of actually being developed and advertised, was very different than the final version of the game that would eventually come out. In that original version of A Nightmare on Elm Street, you wouldn't be playing as a teenager attempting to thwart Freddy Krueger's evil plans. No. You would actually play as Freddy Krueger, and the intention behind the game was that you would control Freddy, and your goal was to kill as many teenagers as possible. Now let that sink in a second. NES title. Rare, being effectively a very close partner to Nintendo itself, was about to release a game where you controlled Freddy Krueger and your goal was to kill teenagers on the titular Elm Street. Well, needless to say, that would not happen. I don't even know how that concept got beyond the planning phase, because there were actual posters that were packed in with other games that advertised this version of A Nightmare on Elm Street. That was a decidedly edgy take, and it's not a surprise to understand why that wouldn't come to be. So, unsurprisingly, that concept would change over time, and eventually the game would take inspiration from a variety of Nightmare on Elm Street movies, because by the time 1990 rolled around, 5 different Nightmare on Elm Street movies had already been released. That's 5 Nightmare on Elm Street movies in just 6 years. That is kinda crazy to me. When you think about movies made today that oftentimes have multiple years in production, the Nightmare on Elm Street series, they were definitely accelerating well beyond the norm, even for films released in the 80s. Now, you might argue that some of those films may not have had all that much artistic value, or certainly not as much artistic value as the very first film, but regardless of your own personal opinion, the fact is, A Nightmare on Elm Street as a film franchise was selling, and many people would watch those films. So the thought was, hopefully many people would play the game based on that film series. When Rare began to retrofit their original concept into a slightly less crazy and controversial kind of concept, they took inspiration from a bunch of different Nightmare on Elm Street films. Most prominently, the third Nightmare on Elm Street film, which was subtitled The Dream Warriors. The Dream Warriors was about a bunch of teenagers who, whenever they fell asleep, could gain special powers that allowed them a unique ability to fight back against Freddy, even in his own domain. That movie also, by the way, would feature an awesome 80s hair metal style ballad that plays during its end credits. Seriously, super cool. And if you like the 80s, you've gotta love that song. Anyway, Rare would take inspiration from that movie along with other Nightmare on Elm Street films, as well as general platforming tropes as found in a variety of 8-bit titles, compiling all of those different inspirations together into a single game that would eventually release on the NES in October of 1990. When A Nightmare on Elm Street for the NES did come out, reviews weren't so kind. Well, I take that back. Some reviewers actually enjoyed the game, but most of them declared the title to be mediocre, with several citing the game as being a low-budget Castlevania clone, or in film world parlance, the equivalent of a straight-to-video sequel of a big-budget theatrical release. Retrospective analysis, like I mentioned earlier, has been even less kind, with many internet personalities lumping A Nightmare on Elm Street in with other licensed title shovelware, declaring the game to be a blight on civilization and one of the worst horror games ever released for a home console. My question is, well, were they right? Well, that's the question we're going to answer today, as we continue to dive deep into Rare's A Nightmare on Elm Street. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play A Nightmare on Elm Street today versus when it was released all the way back in 1990, 35 years ago. Nightmare on Elm Street is, like we talked about, a game where you're going to have a degree of action platforming to experience. And unlike Rare's original concept for the game, which would involve you controlling Freddy Krueger to enact revenge against a bunch of kids and basically kill them, which honestly was never going to fly, in A Nightmare on Elm Street for the NES, the actual game that got created, you control a teenager who would otherwise be tormented by Freddy Krueger. But your goal is to not let that torment happen. You are going to turn the tables on Freddy because you're not going to be a pushover. You are going to gather all of your might, all of your power, all of your dream powers, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You're going to take the fight to Freddy. So let's talk about the kind of experience you get when you start playing A Nightmare on Elm Street. Every time you begin the game, you begin on Elm Street, standing in front of a house. And the first thing you might want to do, which is certainly the first thing that I did, is you want to explore the environment. You want to kind of understand what you're dealing with. So in typical 2D side-scrolling fashion, the game is presented in such a way where you can move right and explore the rest of the world. And as you start walking down Elm Street, you'll notice a few different things. You'll notice 3 what I would call standard houses. These are normal looking houses. A couple have their doors open. There's one that has its doors closed. You'll also notice Elm Street High School, which within the Nightmare on Elm Street movies is actually a core setting because that is where Freddy made his lair. His lair in the films was down in the high school's boiler room. So that is a critical place within the overall mythos of A Nightmare on Elm Street. You also get Elm Street High School in the game. Beyond Elm Street High School, you will also find a fairly dilapidated home, which looks just different enough than the normal houses that you see to know that something bad is going to happen there. You also have the Elm Street Cemetery, as well as a junkyard. So as you explore the game world to start out, you will find effectively 7 different locations. And the question is, well, what can you do at those locations? And it turns out you can actually visit each individual spot where you'll actually experience a number of sub-stages within those given locations. Now, the way the game works is that you don't have free reign to go anywhere you want. And in fact, the game is entirely linear. You have to go into a certain house to start the game. You have to go into the next house, whatever the game decides you need to go into to continue the game, and it kind of goes in sequence. So the sequence is the 3 standard houses, and the 3 standard houses, by the way, it's random which house you can go in at any point in time. So you might start a playthrough, and the very first house you see on the screen is the house you can enter. Other playthroughs, it might be the second house, and other playthroughs, it might be the third house. Regardless, you have to go into one of those 3 houses to start the game. Now, once you go into one of those houses, the actual levels that you have to play through are identical, meaning it doesn't matter what facade you enter from the main world screen, the actual levels you encounter are entirely linear, despite the degree of randomness around which house you enter at the start of the game. Those levels are all designed as a fairly traditional platforming action kind of experience. While the main game is presented as a pseudo open world in that you have technically you can find all of these 7 different locations just at or from the very start of the game, you really can't go in any sequence that you want. So each of those locations, like we were just talking about, made up of several different stages, and you have a singular goal regardless of what stage you might be in. You need to collect all of Freddy's bones that might be found in a given level, and the Freddy bone count is actually displayed prominently in the center of your screen, or at least at the center top of the screen. It's not like you're staring at a counter the entire time you're playing the game. That'd be kind of silly. But every time you enter a stage, it will tell you how many bones are hidden within that individual stage. And I use the term hidden kind of loosely because you're not really going to be seeking out secrets in any of these stages. All of these stages are very linear. They're very straightforward, other than the fact that sometimes the coloring of the stages and the palettes that were chosen for the individual stages might make a certain bone a little bit harder to see. You're not really going to have any difficulty finding the bones as you progress through each stage. The thing is, though, as you move through the game, your overall progression is actually gated based on collecting all of those bones. So when you go into it, let's say you go into a house, just as an example. You go into a house and you might have to get through 2 to 3 stages. Each of those stages requires you to collect a certain number of bones, and you can't progress from one stage to the next before you collect all of those bones. Oftentimes, there's actually a barrier that's on the screen until you collect all the bones that will prevent you from moving on to the next part of the stage. That might be a barrier that looks like a lightning kind of bolt preventing your forward progress. It might be fire that needs to be put out by getting all of Freddy's bones. There might be a couple of different others as well that I just didn't notice because by the time I got to the stage transition, I already had all the bones. But regardless, progression is gated based on collecting all of the bones in a single level. Once you do collect them all, and once you progress through every stage that might be associated with a given location, and once again, there could be anywhere from 2 to, I think the biggest one had maybe 4 substages in it. 3 or 4 substages would be the max per area. Once you collect all the bones in those substages and progress through all the substages, you will have to fight the boss of the level. The bosses in A Nightmare on Elm Street are all based on various variations of nightmare-esque Freddy Krueger monsters that you might have seen if you watched A Nightmare on Elm Street, the film series. So the first boss you encounter is a chained glove. I mentioned that Freddy's glove is actually comprised of several different knives that are attached to the fingers. So one of the bosses is a glove that's effectively chained to the right-hand side of the screen, which is by far the easiest boss in the game because all you have to do is stand on the far left-hand side of the screen and wait for the glove to get close to you and you just hit it a couple times. The glove, to the best of my knowledge, can't actually hit you if you're standing on the left-hand side of the screen. So that is by far the easiest boss in the game. The second boss you'll encounter is Freddy's head, which is also attached to a chain, which prevents it from moving all the way across the screen, which is good. What's not so good is that that head can spit tongues out at you. And you might be wondering, how the heck can Freddy spit tongues, plural, at you? And the answer to that is because he is a demonic essence from the other world, or the netherworld, or whatever you want to call it. He's basically a demon from hell. And he can do whatever the heck he wants, especially if you're dreaming. That boss fight is a little bit more challenging because those tongues will move around the screen, they'll jump at you semi-randomly, and are a little difficult to hit. So you might take some damage when you're fighting that particular boss. The third boss is a flying glove. So this one, the chain comes off and the glove flies around the screen, and you have to try to avoid that and do some damage to it whenever you can. The fourth boss can best be described as a flying ghost bat that also spawns bat minions. And once again, these are all Freddy Krueger bosses, so its face kind of looks a little bit like Freddy Krueger, or at least as close to Freddy Krueger as an 8-bit title can muster from 1990. The next boss is a flying ghost head that also spawns ghost minions. That ghost head is, of course, also Freddy Krueger. And then finally, you have a boss that combines the flying glove and a flying version of the head from the tongue head fight from earlier in the game. This head, though, will spit fireballs at you. You have to defeat both the glove and the head in that boss fight. And then eventually, of course, you will face Freddy himself in all of his glory. Not just the individual pieces of him, but Freddy as a full character. Interestingly, though, the first time you encounter Mr. Krueger will likely not be at the end of the game. Because one of the coolest and most intriguing mechanics in A Nightmare on Elm Street is the sleep, dream, or nightmare world, depending on what you want to call it. So, when you're playing the game, you might notice a meter of sorts in the top of the screen, and that meter will gradually tick down. It looks like a hit points meter. It looks like a traditional life meter that you might see in any other game. But here, it does not represent your life. It actually represents the degree to which you are awake. As the sleep meter, or as the awake meter, I guess it's probably an awake meter. As the awake meter dwindles, you will eventually, once it's fully depleted, go to sleep. Now, when you go to sleep, a few different things happen. First of all, the world that you've been exploring will change into a nightmare, which effectively means a palette swap, and also the replacement of any enemies that you might have seen in the real world with their nightmare counterparts, which are harder variants of different monsters that you might have seen. So as an example, if in the real world you see a spider, in the nightmare world, you're going to see a spider with Freddy's face on it. Yeah, they really love Freddy, by the way. But in all fairness, that's kind of the way the movies were designed as well. You're going to see a lot of Freddy throughout this game. Or an area that might have spikes that pop out of the ground might, in the dream world or the nightmare world, be Freddy's glove popping out of the ground trying to slash at you. So the nightmare world is a good degree harder than the real world, just in terms of the overall environment and the different enemies that you have to face as you move throughout those environments. The good news is that you can wake up if you find a boombox scattered in each level, and each level has a couple of different boomboxes that you'll likely be able to find. And if you didn't go to sleep in the first place, if you're still in the waking world, you could potentially find a cup of coffee that's also scattered throughout each stage. If you pick up a cup of coffee, your awake meter will fully replenish, which means you're not going to go to sleep. The thing is, though, there is actually a strategy here, because sometimes you might want to stay asleep, which I know sounds counterintuitive because, like I was just talking about, the nightmare world is actually more challenging than the waking world. But the reason you might want to stay asleep and not wake up is because, at the end of the day, you are a dream warrior. Yes, that is right. You are a dream warrior, which means when you fall asleep, you don't have to worry about just being able to punch enemies, which is your default form. No, you can find one of 3 different power-ups. Now, those power-ups, by the way, are found in the main stages, meaning the waking stages. So you have to acquire those power-ups before you go to sleep. But if you do acquire those power-ups, when you go into the dream world, you can use those power-ups to make yourself even more effective at combating enemies and Freddy Krueger. Those power-ups that you can find all give you some sort of special abilities to use while you're asleep. The first one is an athlete, which will basically make you jump higher and allow you the ability to throw javelins rapidly at enemies. This is one of my favorite power-ups, by the way, in the entire game, because you can throw those javelins really, really quickly. They have a fair amount of range. It can basically make short work of many enemies that you might find in the dream world. And the jump ability can be very useful. It can also be a little tricky because there are some sections where there might be a bone up in the air or in a corner of a room where, because of the athlete's jump, which is a spinning kind of jump, you may not actually be able to pick up that bone without switching to a different power-up or back to your default form. Regardless, though, the athlete is definitely a very important addition to your overall dream power-ups. You can also become a ninja. Ninjas, as you might expect, can throw shurikens at enemies, though with less range than the athlete's javelins. But more importantly, when you jump around as a ninja, you gain a jump kick ability that will become incredibly useful in many boss fights. Something that I didn't mention yet, but as you attack enemies and as you attack bosses, there will be a period of invincibility, so to speak, and somewhat invisibility after you attack those enemies, which basically makes it so that those enemies can't do damage to you after they've been attacked. You attack them, they begin blinking on the screen for around a second, during which time you can actually pass through them and they can't damage you, and then they regain their overall form, which means they can once again damage you and you can once again damage them. This is something that becomes very useful because as the ninja with your jump kick, you can literally jump through enemies, assuming that you time your attack appropriately and you adjust the vector of your overall attack. Because if you just jump forward and the enemy hits your head, as an example, you're going to take damage. But if you jump and your outstretched foot hits that enemy, you're going to do damage to them, basically pass right through them unscathed, land, and you can do it all over again. The ninja is effectively the boss killer power-up. You want to use the ninja during boss fights because it is incredibly useful and actually makes you survive a lot better than some of the other forms. And then there is the mage, who has a long floaty jump and can throw magical orbs at a very long range towards enemies. The mage is also pretty useful, but there are some detriments that come along with the mage's abilities, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. I kind of like each of these for different reasons. Like I mentioned, my favorite is probably the Athlete, but the Mage is useful for really long-range damage attacks, and the Ninja Jump Kicks are essential at avoiding boss damage. So as you play through the game, you will almost certainly use every single power-up the game gives you, which does add a degree of diversity to the overall gameplay experience. Further adding to that diversity is the fact, like we talked about, that there's both a waking and a dream world. And even further, in the dream world, if you stay asleep for too long, you'll eventually start hearing the dreaded Freddy Krueger nursery rhyme music. You know, the one that goes like, 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. Of course, in 8-bit chiptune glory. If you start hearing that music, you either need to wake up really fast or prepare for a fight against the man himself, Freddy Krueger. Luckily, the fight against Freddy is actually not that bad at all. It's actually easier than some of the boss fights that you'll play throughout the game. The mechanics of the fight are very, very simple, very easy to attack and defeat and avoid attacks from Freddy, but you still have to fight him, which is still a little bit of an extra wrinkle, especially because the game itself is a little difficult. It's not what I would consider an overly difficult game. I would best describe A Nightmare on Elm Street as moderately challenging. Surprisingly, though, unlike a lot of NES action platformers, it's really not too difficult to learn and eventually beat. I think it took me maybe, I don't know, 5, 6, between, I would say 6 and 10 playthroughs in order to eventually beat the game. And each playthrough, it's not like each playthrough is long. They take maybe 30-ish minutes or so. So I'm thinking maybe I spent between 3 and 5 hours. Let's say between 3 and 5 hours playing the game before I eventually beat it. Really not that bad, especially when you compare it to other NES action platforming titles. The way the game is structured is that every time you begin the game, you will start with 5 lives and you'll have 3 continues. And the thing is that as long as you take things slow, as long as you pay attention to your environment, as long as you don't rush in to fight a bunch of enemies or to try to rush through a stage, as long as you take things fairly patiently, you should be okay. There are some inconsistent controls, especially in your default state, which has no special powers, and when you're in your default state, you can really only punch enemies, which, as you might imagine, will require fairly close range, which makes it so that it's a little bit more challenging to deal with enemies that are that close to you. Even beyond that, though, occasionally you'll attempt to throw a punch at an enemy, and it simply won't throw, which will allow an enemy to hit you. And by the way, for each of your lives, you can get hit around 4-ish times before you eventually lose a life. Unfortunately, there's no life meter on the screen, so you don't really know how many hits you can take before you end up dying and having to go to a next life, which I have to say is a little bit of a design flaw. I don't know why that would be. Why there'd be no indicator of how many times you can get hit, because sometimes it feels like you can get hit more or less depending on the enemy that you're fighting. That might be just totally in my head, but without having some sort of indicator on the screen, I will never know. So that is a design flaw with the game. I do think they should have had some sort of life meter on the screen to help you understand how close you were to losing a life. And the fact is, even after you become proficient with the game, you will occasionally lose some lives. And a lot of the times that happens, it's driven primarily by the controls. There are some issues with the controls. I mentioned that sometimes you'll attempt to throw a punch and the punch just simply won't throw. Well, that same issue will affect your dream powers as well, and can even be a bit more irritating than a control or than an input simply failing to register and not doing anything. There were times, and this really happened as I was playing using my mage dream power. There were times where I was playing as my mage, I would fire a projectile, and the projectile would literally pass right through them without damaging them at all. When that happens, and it doesn't happen often, but it happens enough. When it happens, though, it is definitely not great. Also impacting your enjoyment of the game's controls is your ability to jump, because as you jump around the game world, which is something you will be doing a lot in the game, as you would with many platforming titles, but jumping in A Nightmare on Elm Street can be a bit floaty, and sometimes a little bit tricky to figure out, especially when trying to make some challenging jumps in the game's final stages. Sometimes I would walk off the edge of a platform inadvertently, while other times I would jump and just be a smidge short of landing on my desired target. While other times still, I occasionally overshot the platform that I was jumping towards and plummeted to my death. Overall, there are definitely some issues with the controls for the game, but surprisingly, despite those issues, they never really became all that frustrating, and after a few hours of dedicated playtime, you will likely be proficient enough to beat the game despite those inconsistencies. The only question is the game fun enough to warrant those several hours of focused attention? Well, we're going to keep talking about that and other aspects of the game in just a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos to look up. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based on word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for A Nightmare on Elm Street for the Nintendo Entertainment System, the back of the box says, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Something frightening has been happening on Elm Street lately. It seems that with each waking day, another gruesome discovery is made. Another neighborhood teen has mysteriously passed away into the dark stillness of the night. Everyone says it's natural causes, but it seems as if something or someone has been picking them off one by one in their sleep. It's a horrible nightmare come true, and this nightmare has a name: Freddy Krueger. It's up to you and your remaining friends to search Elm Street for his bones, which have been scattered about, then collect and burn them in the high school furnace. If you can just stay awake long enough, you might be able to end Freddy's reign of terror for good. You had better hurry though, it's getting late, and you can feel your eyelids getting heavier and heavier by the minute. If fighting for survival against Freddy Krueger appears to be just a little too much for you to handle, don't worry, because this is a NES satellite-compatible cartridge. With it, you can call on 3 of your friends for help, and the 4 of you can accept the challenge simultaneously. That doesn't necessarily make it easier. It might simply mean that Freddy gets 4 new victims instead of just 1. That's up to you. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, one showing Elm Street in front of a house, the other showing one of the internal house stages, and yet another one showing you in front of the Elm Street Cemetery. And I've got to say, yeah, this actually sells me on the game. I already mentioned that when I was younger, I really did enjoy the game. I enjoyed the film series from The Nightmare on Elm Street, all of the different movies that were released there. Yes, they could be campy and they weren't the best actual movies out there, but I liked them and I liked this game. And reading the box now, it sells me. It really does sell me on the title. It reads just like a Nightmare on Elm Street film, and it makes you feel like you're going to be playing a game set within that film universe. And for me, it ticks the boxes. It makes it so that it gives you that experience. If you were a fan of the film, then you'd probably want to play the game. And that's exactly how I feel about it. There's also some screenshots, by the way, on the back of the box, which I did mention, and the screenshots make the game look pretty darn good. The graphics look nice, especially for an 8-bit title. We're going to talk more about the graphics in literally like 30 seconds. But the overall back of the box, it just feels right. And the front of the box has Freddy Krueger on it, which feels even more right. Yes, this box definitely sells me on the game. I would have picked this up if I saw it when I was younger, and in fact, I did. I do own this game. Unfortunately, the box has been lost to time, but I do own the game, and it sold me back then, and it still sells me today. The one thing I do want to mention, and this is just a minor blurb that's on the back of the box, but actually has far-ranging implications. The box talks about the fact that if you feel like fighting for survival yourself is too much, you can use the NES Satellite. Some of you might be wondering, what the heck's an NES Satellite? Well, the NES Satellite was a device that enabled you to use up to 4 wireless controllers with the NES that effectively facilitated multiplayer play. So for A Nightmare on Elm Street, you could actually play with up to 4 people on screen at the same time, which I've got to say is pretty darn awesome. I did not play with 4 people or 3 people or 2 people for my playthrough for this episode of the podcast, but regardless, I love the fact that multiplayer is included here. I love the fact that you could have up to 4 people on screen at the same time, which almost turns this into a pseudo beat-em-up-ish kind of affair. It's still mostly an action platformer, and I'm not sure exactly how lives and continues are shared amongst multiple people playing the game, but regardless, I love the fact that this feature is included, and it really does set it apart from a lot of other platforming titles that were out there. Anyway, we're going to move beyond the back of the box to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. A Nightmare on Elm Street looks pretty darn good for an 8-bit title. Now, admittedly, the environments aren't all that complex, and some settings are reused a fair bit, like the inside of houses, a boiler room, underground basement kind of setting, and several outdoor environments. But overall, the graphics here work. Character details are fine, enemies have a nice amount of variety, boss fights mimic several fairly well-known Freddy Krueger forms. All of this looks pretty good from my perspective. One of the highlights, though, for me, is the fact that when you fall asleep, the environment actually changes, which I thought was a great touch. At the end of the day, it really is only a palette swap for the most part, but regardless, it does make each stage feel unique. And in fact, one time, I got to a specific stage while I was awake after having never gotten to that particular point in the game without being asleep. And when I saw the level, my first thought was, is this a new stage that I've never seen before? In reality, it wasn't, but the degree of palette swap was so extreme that it felt new, which I appreciated. Animations, meanwhile, are fine, though there are occasionally glitches between the controls and the animations that play out, where you try to do something, your character animates, but then the thing you try to do simply doesn't happen. This is most prevalent with the mage's magic orb attack, like we talked about, where it'll animate just fine, but the orb may in fact pass right through enemies, failing to damage them. Not really an issue from an animation perspective, but it is something to mention as a disconnect between the visuals you see and the gameplay you experience. Overall, though, A Nightmare on Elm Street is not a bad-looking NES title. Moving on to the sound and music. The music here is much, much better than it has any right being. It mixes creepiness with standard action platformer fare to create an eclectic mix of surprisingly catchy songs, especially when you consider this was a licensed title, which oftentimes means cash grab. If that was the case, musician David Wise, who is perhaps best known for his work on the stellar Donkey Kong Country soundtracks, did not get the memo, because the music here is great. Sound effects, meanwhile, are fine. They're there, they work, and there's really not much else to say. Overall, the audio was a pleasant surprise here. I actually really enjoyed the music in the game, and the auditory environment in general, definitely a highlight for me. Moving on to the story, if you've seen any Nightmare on Elm Street films, you pretty much know what to expect here. But for the uninitiated, Freddy Krueger is the undead spirit demon of a previously living man who, while he was alive, tormented and killed children. One day, a group of concerned citizens captured Freddy and burnt him to death, taking the law into their own hands and, from their perspective, making the world a safer place. Well, unfortunately for them, Freddy holds a grudge. So when those individuals started having children of their own, Freddy returned, in their dreams, to torment and kill their now teenage progeny. That was the framework for the original Nightmare on Elm Street, and over the course of that movie's sequels, the story would evolve, or devolve as the case may be, to basically turn it into a standard slasher flick kind of experience, where Freddy is simply a nightmare demon who can do things to you in your sleep that end up hurting you in reality. And it is that much more simplified story that forms the foundation of A Nightmare on Elm Street, the game. You play as an unnamed teenager who has superpowers when you dream, and it's up to you to take the fight to Freddy and his fear-inducing visions that you experience when you dream. You have to find all of Freddy's bones and bring them back to where it all began, the boiler room of Elm Street High. If you can return to Freddy's original lair of despair and burn his bones in the boiler room that he once called home, then you can cleanse the world of his evil spirit once and for all. If not, then it's very possible that your nightmares will become reality. So here's the thing about the story in A Nightmare on Elm Street. None of it is given to you in-game at all. There is an assumption, and it's probably a fair one, that you know the underlying story from the films, and therefore there's no need for story exposition in the game based on those films. I personally think that's fine, as a platform action title doesn't technically need an explicit story to make it a worthwhile experience, though I would argue that given the amount of backstory and lore that existed in the Freddy Krueger cinematic universe at the point this game was made, it wouldn't have hurt to include a couple brief cutscenes or interactions to help flesh out the game's narrative just a little bit. I'm not holding it against the game, it's just something I would have appreciated. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we already talked about the general structure and framework of the game, so we're not going to rehash all of that here. What we didn't talk too much about was the game's controls, which are pretty darn simple. You move around with your directional pad, you jump using your A button, and you punch or use one of your dream powers using your B button. The start button pauses the game, as it often does, and the select button lets you cycle through your available dream powers, assuming you're actually asleep, or in a boss fight with Freddy, which presumably can only take place while you're dreaming, even if you might have been awake just a moment prior. The controls here are simple, and they mostly work. Note that I say mostly because there are occasions when the controls simply feel a bit sluggish, most notably when you're trying to rapidly attack an enemy, or when you're trying to complete a tricky jump from the edge of a platform to another section of a stage. In those instances, the controls can fail you, and in other instances, the jumping mechanics can feel just a bit too floaty for their own good, though honestly, these are all issues that are fairly easy to overcome with a little patience and practice. Overall, the controls here feel fine, once you get used to them, though I'd be lying if I suggested they had the same snappiness and precision as other popular and arguably better made Nintendo platforming titles. Otherwise though, I do have to say that I was happily surprised by the way the game felt to play. Like I mentioned multiple times, I had played A Nightmare on Elm Street when I was younger, and I have fond memories of playing the game, and getting a little scared in the process. At the same time, though, my adult self has recognized that this isn't widely considered to be a good game, so I did have a bit of trepidation that my memories would be tarnished by my current playthrough, especially considering that the only way I beat the game when I was younger was through the use of a Game Genie code to make me invincible. I feared that A Nightmare on Elm Street would either be too difficult or too poorly made to maintain my nostalgia-soaked memories, but luckily, that isn't the case at all. The game is moderately challenging, but nowhere near what I expected, and the game's overall design is much more detailed than I recalled or anticipated, with the whole dream world versus waking state coupled with the special dream powers you can acquire, making the game feel considerably deeper and more faithful to its source material than it has any right being. Part of me can't believe I'm saying this, but A Nightmare on Elm Street is actually a good game. There are some flaws that prevent it from being great, but honestly, not every game needs to be great to be a worthwhile experience to play. Sometimes, good is enough, and that's exactly what you'll get if you sit down to play A Nightmare on Elm Street. So, what is our verdict on A Nightmare on Elm Street? Well, like I just mentioned, A Nightmare on Elm Street is a good game, but not quite a great game, so it unfortunately can't make its way into our pantheon of classic gaming. That said, A Nightmare on Elm Street is still something I recommend you play if you're looking for a solid, albeit not amazing, action platforming experience, especially if you're looking for a way to fill the time on a rainy fall afternoon, which is why A Nightmare on Elm Street is certainly deserving of its spot in our list of golden oldies. This is a licensed title that is actually fun to play, and proves that even though LJN was not known for their high-quality licensed releases, there are occasions where an LJN game can be decidedly funner than you might expect. Such is the case with A Nightmare on Elm Street, which has just become the newest member in our collection of Golden Oldies. It is now time to talk about this week's gaming challenges. They are all, of course, focused on A Nightmare on Elm Street for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Your first challenge, which is worth 1 coin, is to simply fall asleep. Like we talked about, there is a sleep meter in the game, or more accurately, an awake meter. If that awake meter depletes all the way, you will fall asleep and enter the dream world. If you can do that, you will earn 1 coin. Your second challenge, worth 2 coins, is to fight a flying claw. That is one of the bosses in the game. I believe it is the 3rd boss. Yes, the 3rd boss in the game. If you can fight that 3rd boss, you don't have to beat him. If you can just get up to that fight, you will earn 2 coins. And finally, for 3 coins, take a walk through the cemetery. You do have to progress through a few different levels to get there, but once you do and you arrive at the cemetery, if you can take a picture of yourself walking through that area, you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on A Nightmare on Elm Street. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast, expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Uninvited for the NES. So definitely write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience, and get your comments featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Uninvited. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.